Hi everyone, this is Peter Beal, and in this short lecture I want to talk just briefly about the Greek canon of proportions as a critical principle in understanding the underlying ideas of Greek art and architecture, and it's a concept that has a great deal of influence going forward in the history of the visual arts. The first thing that you have to understand, and we'll be summing this up much too briefly, but it's a good founding principle, is that by the time we come into the sort of heyday of so-called classical Greek sculpture and architecture in the 5th century, we're also seeing a priority in Greek philosophy towards the inquiry and establishment of objective truth. This is something that is a critical departure and marks the significance of Greek philosophy for succeeding millennia, basically. We see this in the pre-Socratics, who were looking for, in essence, non-divine, non-supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. And we're certainly going to see explorations of the same sort, in a sense, in the areas of ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics, so the study of beauty, and of course that feeds directly into the realm of the visual arts. The idea of objective truth and understanding the true nature of things is particularly important in the work of Pythagoras, who is looking at the world and seeing that the true underlying structure of it is contained in numbers and ratios, the relationships of numbers to one another. And this is something that Plato in particular is going to pick up on in his understanding of the nature of reality. And certainly I think is at least present, perhaps attempted by a number of important artists and works of art. So here's a sort of reconstruction of the appearance from left to right of Pythagoras as immortalized in Raphael's famous rendering of the theme of philosophy, commonly known as the School of Athens, in the Vatican in the Stanza degli Segnatura. And then in the middle, a rendition of Socrates, and on the right, a version of Plato. So this is just to have a kind of visual equivalent of some of the characters we're talking about. If we think about Plato and his understanding of beauty, the theme of idealism is certainly paramount. And if we look, for instance, at a description of the process of love as seen in Plato's Symposium, it's pretty clear that this sense of moving from the particular to the general is quite critical. So in this discussion from the Symposium, where the woman Diotima describes the process of love, we can see, as it says here, this process beginning by falling in love with the beauties of the body. And as it says, falling in love with one individual body, and then waking up to the thought, the understanding that the beauty of any one body is closely related to the beauty of any other, and that if you're going to be devoted to loveliness in the general sense, then you're going to have to look at a lot of different bodies. And then, as this passage notes here, we must become the lovers of every lovely body, and ultimately recognize the relationship of the individual to the whole, and ultimately, as the passage concludes, calling the individual one of little or no importance. For the visual arts, this has a number of important equivalents. There are stories, for instance, of sculptors and painters, in essence, finding beauty by selecting particular features from a number of different beautiful bodies. Another thing that's implied by this might be that the individual that's described in this passage might ask why or how beauty is related to others. And that, I think, logically leads to the problem of proportion and ratio that is present, for instance, in architecture, present in the creation of the human body. I think is alluded to by the likes of Pythagoras, particularly in his studies of music. If we think about Greek art and aesthetic theory, there's little question when we study the record of the Greek visual arts that the human figure, and particularly the male nude, is a preoccupation of Greek art history. This develops over time, certainly initially influenced going back to the Archaic period, so in essence the 7th century BCE. From that time forward to the 5th century, an increasingly idealistic approach is seen. And perhaps concomitant with that, a closer link with principles of architecture. And again, the aspects of mathematics, proportions, ratio, and looking for a kind of perfect visual expression of beauty is present there. If we follow, for instance, this trajectory from roughly the going back to the 6th century, the late 6th century, into the late 5th century, we can see how Greek artists are concerned with an increasingly naturalistic representation of the human body, particularly in terms of weight-bearing and weight-bearing functions and movement. And this is realized in Kouros figures, as seen on the left, grave markers, and bronze sculptures we see on the right, particularly prized as bronze, the ability of bronze to represent bodies in motion and extending into space. As we go forward into the 5th century, that preoccupation with the perfect aesthetic ideal, something that perhaps reaches its fruition architecture in the buildings of the Acropolis, is started by Pericles. We can see the development of this theory of symmetry and perfect proportion. It's worth just going back briefly to think about the that source of inspiration and knowledge for much of Greek culture, and that's of course that of ancient Egypt, to see the Egyptian canon by means of comparison to the what I'll call the Greek canon, perhaps more specifically the Polycleidian canon. On the left we have a grid diagram, and this is derived from numerous examples of Egyptian tomb painting and carving, where the surface to be decorated is in essence laid out with a grid pattern that indicates to an observer that it's quite clear that the Egyptian system was to create the human body in terms of a series of segments. And the segments would be understood through a grid system in such a way that a human body could be constructed according to sort of lining up those segments. And this type of system is particularly effective for the relatively static and geometric forms of Egyptian architecture, in essence to submit the irregularities and complexities of the human bodies to an external geometric regular grid. It's a great way to map out the body, and perhaps appropriate for the otherworldly effects of Egyptian art. The Greek canon, or what we'll talk about as the Polycleidian canon, as illustrated somewhat anachronistically here by Leonardo da Vinci, we can also think of the Vitruvian canon, has to do with the quality that Vitruvius, an important author from the 1st century BCE to CE, writes about, known as symmetry. And symmetry is an important factor in understanding the Greek canon because it, in essence, seeks a map of the human body that is self-referential. And I think that this is an important point to keep clear, that it's not an external standard that's imposed from without, the way that we see in the Egyptian example. So symmetry is the idea that the parts of any given thing relate to each other, and that they relate to the relate to the whole, I guess, is the best way of thinking it. The way that Vitruvius puts it is, this is translated from the Latin: symmetry is a proper agreement between the members of the work itself and relation between different parts in the whole general scheme in accordance with a certain part selected as standard. Thus, in the human body, there's a kind of symmetrical harmony between forearm, foot, palm, finger, and other small parts. And so it is, because Vitruvius is writing about architecture, so it is with perfect buildings. Here's just an edition of Vitruvius, who becomes very popular in the Renaissance. Latin and then later vernacular editions of his book start appearing in the 15th and 16th century. And he's really the only comprehensive written source for the ideas of the Greeks in art and architecture. So, as I've just read here, right, there's this kind of symmetrical harmony between forearm and foot. And you can test this yourself and compare the length of your forearm and your foot, and you'll see that by and large, across a broad sample of population, it's exactly the same. Now, Vitruvius is going to use this knowledge to say that when you design a temple, that you have to depend upon this symmetrical aspect, that you must pay attention to symmetry and proportion. There really can't be any principles, any fundamental law or logic to designing a temple. And the problem with that is that if you make a temple that fails to subscribe to these principles, whereas it says here merits and faults are visible, especially faults, that the gods to whom the temple is going to be dedicated are not going to be happy with it. And so that's why when we think about numbers and perfection in architecture, that's the priority that Vitruvius is putting forward. And it's a good thing to think about also in terms of music, which depends upon numbers and ratios. That harmony, as kind of almost literally physically perceived through the ear, depends upon an agreeable arrangement of geometrical lengths, such as with stringed instruments. And that if we analyze, for instance, sound patterns in the sort of basic physical vibrational sense, that the same principles apply. So if we look at something like the very famous Doryphorus or Spear Bearer by Polyclitus, there's a Roman copy on the left in this scene, we can begin to reconstruct, thanks to Vitruvius, the possibility, again, we don't know this for sure, what the system is. We know that such a system existed because ancient authors point to this, and Vitruvius mentions Polyclitus specifically. While we can't necessarily reconstruct it exactly, thanks to the variations that Roman artists might have introduced in their copies, nevertheless, we know that there's a close correspondence between the principles that Vitruvius is expressing, such as we might see in the Parthenon, or any number of other ancient Greek temples, and Polyclitus' own attempt to create the perfect, balanced, harmonious human and really typically male body. So when we see, whether it's in sculpture on the right or Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, we see in both artists an effort to understand and frame the complexity of the human world, as it were, within the body, sometimes described by classical authors, and Leonardo himself as a microcosm, to see it in relation to a larger cosmos of order expressed through numbers.